And with her, the question was right away, who would marry a woman that cannot have children, that's sitting in a wheelchair and cannot do your household or overlook your household for you? I mean, it really sounds quite cruel.
It is brutal. It's the Germany Experience, the podcast about life in Germany as seen through the eyes of outsiders. I'm your host, Sean. Subscribe to the podcast if you're listening to this, wherever you're listening to this. We're on all the major podcast platforms, and the podcast is also on YouTube. If you want to see videos of some of the interviews, subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you like this podcast, help spread the word. And a good way of doing this is by sharing it in your favorite expat Facebook group or any community that you're in where there's discussions about life in Germany. You can share the link to my website, thegermanexperience.de, or to one of your favorite episodes, whatever you want to do. But every share helps to grow the podcast and the community. Now, on to this week's episode, and we are doing something a little different to the usual format this week. We as foreigners are not always aware of German history beyond the big milestone events that we all learn about in school or that we know about from reading Wikipedia or whatever. And something I have wanted to do more of on this podcast is to look more closely at German history. So every now and then, I'm going to do an episode that looks at some aspect of German history. And for our first foray into Germany's past, we are going to look at the stories of three incredible women from Germany's history. They're women who faced adversity, but still did monumental things that have an impact on Germany and the world even today. And yet, in all three cases, the women did not necessarily get the credit or the recognition that they deserve. I was inspired to do this by the podcast of this week's guest. It's called HerStory, and I've linked to it in the show notes. It's a German podcast that looks at women from history all across the globe, and it's hosted by Jasmin, who is a German living in the USA. Jasmin is such a great storyteller, and she joins me for this episode to tell the stories of three German women she admires. And because it was difficult to limit her to just three options, she also gives two honorable mentions right at the end. It's a great history lesson because these stories also give us some indication of what German society was like at the time that these women lived. So now I invite you to enjoy the stories of Elisabeth Selbert, Margarete Steif, and Gerda Tarrau, as told by Jasmin. So Jasmin, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. So we got introduced on the internet, Jasmin, as these things sometimes happen, and it was through a former guest on the show, Jürgen from the Ach team, and they were here for the Ask a German episode. And afterwards on Twitter, I can't remember how it came about, but he pretty much said to me, "Hey, I think you guys would do something great together. I'd love to hear some." I can't remember exactly what the context was. It was something along those lines, and that's how I got introduced to you, essentially. Mm-hmm. And then I took a listen to your podcast. You're the host of a podcast called HerStory. And when I heard it, I was like, yeah, well, we definitely have to do something together. So here we are.
Yeah, here we are. That's right. Thanks to Jürgen. Correct.
Thanks to Jürgen, yes. But first, let's talk about your background. You're a German and you're living in the United States at the moment. Correct. So maybe just explain how you ended up there.
So I always kind of flirted with the idea of working and living abroad for a time. And so I'm a journalist. That's my actual profession when I'm not podcasting. Right. And I'm a freelance journalist. So I do have a little bit more freedom choosing where I want to work. And so at some point in my career, I met someone, I started dating someone who was an American. And then that was kind of the ultimate little nudge that brought me to the point where I said, okay, I'm just going to combine these two things, grab that opportunity and say, okay, I'm going to move abroad. So I went to the US in 2015. And shortly thereafter, obviously, there was a change in the White House. So yes. I got to experience all of that. And so when that relationship at some point fell apart and when that ended, I was initially in Texas. I moved from Texas to Arizona. So now I've been in Arizona for it's like my third year here. So,
wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's get to your podcast now, which is called HerStory. Give me a summary of what your podcast is about.
Oh boy, you want my elevator pitch?
Yes, elevator pitch.
So HerStory is a little play on words with history, obviously. So I think that pretty much also gives away what it is. It really focuses on women in history. Mm-hmm. So what I'm trying to do there is I'm trying to pull women that had important roles in history and that were forgotten back into the spotlight. Because I always, even in my job, I come across, I research stuff, and then obviously I go into the past of certain developments, whatever. And I come across women and constantly I wonder, why haven't I ever heard of them? Why were they not in the history books or whatever? So that's why I felt like at some point we kind of really need to change that. And then when I looked around, there wasn't anything on the German market. And then I was like, well, okay, I'll just give that a try. So I kind of stumbled into it a little bit, and then that's how I started it last year. So while everyone was going down on their podcast consumption, I started making one.
Great time to start, Jasmin.
Yeah, but it worked out pretty well. So you could say I didn't really think that through, but it worked out really well because you're not the only one who does enjoy it. So, which is obviously great for me. I really love the feedback that I get for it.
Yeah. And I think, so when I compare our two podcasts, your podcast takes a lot of research, I would imagine, to get, because you're telling the stories of these women. So I would assume you don't, in fact, I know you don't just look at the Wikipedia article, you read books about it, because the show notes come with recommendations of books to read about the topic and so on. So you need a lot of research. I for the show, I do very little research. So I really admire that about the amount of work that you must put in to making the podcast. And so I thought what I'd do is get you to do some more work. So I like the I like the concept of your podcast so much. And when we got to talking, one of the things that I really thought would be a cool thing to do would be to look at German women from German's history, because I think this is something that would be interesting. It's definitely interesting to me, so it must be interesting to my listeners, because we obviously don't necessarily know the ins and outs of German history. We know maybe the big touch points and so on. And as you said, a lot of women have not made it into the history books as they maybe deserve to make it in there. And so we just, as foreigners in Germany, we might never hear these stories. So I thought it was a great idea to kind of do the same concept as you do on your podcast, but for you to select 3 German women. And I think this was a difficult thing for you to limit your search to 3 women, right?
Yes. I mean, the fact that you said it, or the fact that it makes sense to choose German women, did narrow it down a little bit, even though not very significantly. But on the note that you said you wanted to give me some more work, I'm very savvy. So I looked at women that I have covered already, where I've done my research.
That's cheating, Jasmin. I will not allow it.
So I did go into my notes there and compile something. So I did find 3, and I did find 2 more. So
okay, so we got 3 main stories, and then we got 2 honorable mentions.
Correct. Yeah. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to go into different areas. So I think you're right. It's cool to look at where have women had an impact in German history, and to also look at different areas, meaning politically, but also when it comes to business, for example, and culturally. So that's kind of what I've done. That's what I'm trying to cover.
Very exciting. Well, I'm so pleased that you agreed to do that, because when I made the suggestion, I was like, well, I don't know if this is something that you'd want to do, but you were very enthusiastic about it, and I'm so happy. So I can't wait to hear what you've prepared as these 3 women. So let's start. Let's start with the first, whichever one you're going to start with. So let's get into it.
Yeah. So number 1 would be Elisabeth Selbert. And so she lived from 1896. She is actually responsible for a very important sentence in the German Grundgesetz. So expats who have to learn the German Grundgesetz will come across Article 3, which is the sentence, men and women have equal rights. And obviously a pretty important sentence, a pretty important remark to make when it comes to men and women. And so she's the one who fought for this sentence in a very male-dominated panel.
Right.
When the German Grundgesetz was formulated after the Second World War. And she wasn't really that much rewarded for her efforts because her own party then almost kind of shunned her a little bit later on. So that's sometimes these stories of women come with the sad part, and that's kind of the sad part there. Yeah.
So you said, I guess you said it's after the Second World War. So this is obviously the mid to late 1940s. Right?
Correct. It was formed in 49, formulated in 49, the Grundgesetz.
Before that, was she the one that raised this as a discussion point for the Grundgesetz? Was it just that this was not under consideration when that whole thing was being drafted? Or was this, is this something that she worked on to make more prominent in that?
She worked on it to make it more prominent. So there was a similar rule under the Weimar Republic, which was the state form that we had before the Nazis came to power. And there was already an article that said something along the lines of men and women have similar rights. It just wasn't as clear. So there was kind of a weak point there that would have allowed the courts to still make a distinction because, so basically males were the male standard and a woman biologically was different. So, and with her biology and her body obviously being different, the way the draft was formulated would have allowed them to make exceptions for women. And that would have led to women really have not equal rights but maybe they're supposed to pay taxes, but they're not going to be allowed to do all the same things that men are allowed to do. So she understood this as a lawyer, and that's why she pushed so hard for it. And I find her particularly fascinating because she became a lawyer later in life. So she really wasn't cut out for a profession like that because she was initially even denied a higher education. So I find it all the more impressive that she ended up fighting for it like that.
Yeah. Do you know what drove her to law in the first place?
She wanted to understand. She was already politically involved and active, and she wanted to understand really what she was fighting for, and she wanted to be able to really make viable points. So she felt like, I need to understand the field of law, and that's how she got into it. But it was even harder. She even had to go back one more step because she didn't even have a higher education. She didn't have a high school graduation. So she first had to finish high school, which she did at the age of 30. And then, and then she went into law. And at that time, she was one of the very few women to actually study law. So she was she first studied in Marburg, and there she was the only woman. And then she went to Göttingen, and there she was 1 out of 5 women in what was actually a class of 300. So,
wow.
And women still had to leave the lecture hall when the professor was talking about, for example, sexual cases. So sexual law. So they had to, So it's just, I do find it very, very impressive. She's impressive on so many levels to me, because of that education, but then also, I mean, how she holds herself up during the Nazi time. So there's a lot there.
Wow, it is amazing that she was able to fight for this. And do you know, like, how much resistance did she have when she was fighting for this? Was there a lot of resistance, or was it a case of people understanding what she was trying to say and the arguments were valid and accepted straight away?
Not straight away. So as I said, it was a very male-dominated panel. So maybe we have to kind of set the scene there. So at the end of World War II, we have the Allies coming in, and obviously we have Russia in Eastern Germany, and then we have the other 3 Western allies, Great Britain, the United States, and France in the West. And they, at some point, they basically tell West Germany to formulate this constitutional law, which is going to be the foundation of the new democratic society in Germany. And they give them 8 months to do that, which that's quite of a task to do in 8 months. And I mean, Germany comes out of the war, and obviously almost every male in the country has been involved in fighting at the front in the war, and in one way or another. And who wasn't a part of the war was persecuted by it. And so German women took over a lot of responsibilities that men had filled, because obviously if you're fighting in the war, you're not at home, you're not producing ammunition, you're not producing food, you're not doing any of that. So women, like in many other countries during those war years, took over male roles and professions and worked in those. And then on top of that, obviously they bore all this trauma and of the war and all the death, and then after the Allies came in, obviously you were still faced with this country that basically lay in rubbles. So they helped rebuild the country. And now here we are talking about women really, they've kind of proved their position here. They've proved what they're capable of. And so we really should afford them the same rights as men. And the men are sitting in this panel. So it's a panel of 65 people, and only 4 of them are women. And there's even one newspaper at the time that already, there's only one newspaper at the time that already says the women are kind of underrepresented in this panel.
Okay.
So there's 61 men there looking at 4 women, and one of them steps up to the podium and says, "So this is the sentence that we should put into this document." And they're like, "What?" So they really don't understand it right away. And she really keeps talking about it, and she keeps making the point and says there's kind of a moral obligation by now. If you look back at what women did during the war, how they basically held this country up and helped hold the country together, more or less. You really have to give them a seat at the table, and you have to afford them the same rights. And still, they had several rounds where they would vote on these different articles and the sentences and whatever formulations they had in drafts going around. And it certainly failed several times. I think 2 or 3 times. And so in the end, Elisabeth Zebert then kind of, she's had it. And then so she goes up to the podium and she's like, okay, if this fails again tonight, I'm going to stage a protest. And that's what she did.
Really?
So she went out and she kind of went around, not just around town, but she traveled around and spoke to all kinds of women. And she really educated them on this might just look like a simple sentence, but what does that actually mean for your daily life? What kind of rights does that give you? And I mean, we're still at that time living in a society where women give up their names right away when they marry. They cannot open a bank account without the men's consent. They cannot take jobs without the men's consent, all of these things. And so she educates them, and they start writing letters to this panel.
Okay.
To the Parlamentarische Rat, which is that panel. And these letters really come in tubs. That's how many letters they get. And they really implore them to really now take them seriously and push this through. And what she also does is she kind of forges an alliance with the women in the Communist Party. And they support her on this issue as well. And that will be something that kind of comes back later to haunt her a little bit, because her own party, the SPD, doesn't really like that, that she went outside of her own party. Right. And she even had to convince the 3 other women who initially weren't really sure what she was trying to do there. So she really was making a big effort all around.
So it was really her against almost the entire panel, basically.
Yeah, basically. And then eventually, I think it's the 3rd or the 4th vote where it actually goes through. Okay. And then she's quite proud and happy about it, obviously.
Yeah. That's very inspirational. I mean, the courage you must have to stand up in a room like that and speak your mind, and not only speak your mind, but not back down when it's not working out in your favor, and just keep pursuing it. That's incredible. Very inspiring story.
I just loved how she did it, and how all these letters really came in, and she had like 40,000 metal workers, female metal workers behind her at some point,
Wow.
and plus on top of all the other women out there that she spoke to. And I think she even reached out to the wives of some of those delegates in that panel. So she talked to them, and they would then give their husband a talking to over dinner.
Right.
Quite smart. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's
I
very
really
good.
like that. She knew how that worked.
And then you said later on she was kind of shunned by her party because of the communism thing, or
Yeah, so one of the leaders of the SPD at that time, I think he's still remembered, and like streets are named after him and whatnot. So people might have come across his name, Kurt Schumacher. So he was a very
oh
famous
yes,
leader at that time. Yeah.
right.
And he was not a big fan of going outside the party. He really didn't like her approach to bring in communists, especially because you also have this friction between East and West already coming up, right? And
That's right.
so
Yeah.
the communists they're a little bit of a question mark. Do they really support the democracy like we do? And so Schumacher is kind of, he's a has a hands-off approach, that he really doesn't want much to do with them. And the fact that she just reached across party lines and reached out to them, he doesn't really like that. So when then the first Bundestag is elected, she is not even nominated to be on the list to actually, so people can't even vote for her. And later on, because she's a lawyer, she's interested to become a judge at the highest court in the country, the Bundesverfassungsgericht. And they won't even nominate her for that in 1958 because they feel like she's too politically engaged. So she's kind of her own party is really kind of not very thankful there. So she goes back into private practice, and she practices family law in her own practice in Kassel. And she works there until she's 86.
Wow.
So
Wow. And pretty much in obscurity almost, I should imagine, after all those years of what she had done.
Yeah, and she really only came back in, I want to say, I mean, in the 80s before she died. She still was pretty outspoken. Several times she talked about how equal pay was still not achieved. And I mean, she would still have a field day today because we're still looking at some of these
still
issues.
There.
I'm very sure she would have something to say about that. And when she was asked, she made her voice heard until the very end. But she was a bit in obscurity, and she is coming back a little. There's now a prize or an award named after her for women who actually work towards gender equality. I think she might get a bit more publicity later this year when it's her birthday, because she was born in 1896. So she'll have a round anniversary this year, and I think there's going to be a little bit more that we might hear about her. So I hope.
That's Elizabeth Selbert. So for any foreigners out there, now you know the name and you know the context if we hear more about her this year in Germany. So let's move on to that was a woman in politics, a great German woman in politics. Now, so let's move on to the next sector. What are we looking at next?
We're looking at business. So number 2 would be Margarete Steif. And you might know her if you've been in a kid's room, in a German child's room, or in a toy store. She is the manufacturer of Steif kids' toys. Yeah. And what she became particularly famous for, or what the company became particularly famous for, was the teddy bear. And they're the ones who have this little button in their ear. That's kind of their branding, that their stuffed toys have this little button or knob in their ear.
Okay.
So, and she was born in 1847 and lived until 1909. So she really formed a very successful company that still exists today pretty early. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe take me through the founding of that company.
She was kind of almost forced into it. I don't know if she would have chosen it if she would have had a regular life path, so to speak.
Okay.
So she was born into a time that was pretty much for women, that was full of housework and being very obedient and make yourself useful. That was kind of the framework at the time. But shortly after her birth, she was like 18 months old, she became polio. And so she had a quite severe case of polio, and it left her paralyzed, and she also had a very weak right hand. And with that, it almost instantly became clear that she wouldn't really have the normal path, quote unquote, of a woman at that time, which is go off, be married, have kids, and then basically do the household for your husband and your kids.
Right.
And unfortunately, at that time, really parents especially raised their girls to really just be married off at some point. And with her, the question was right away, who would marry a woman that cannot have children, that's sitting in a wheelchair and cannot do your household or overlook your household for you? I mean, it really sounds quite cruel.
It is brutal. I mean, and this is not that long ago. I mean, it's maybe a century or so, but it's also not that far in the past.
Yeah, it really isn't. And she just kind of sets out and proves them all wrong, which is really quite impressive. And so what initially happens is she kind of starts off on a path that is typical for women at that time. So before they marry, they would do needlework. That's something that was pastime, but also something that women could do to earn a little bit of money. And then as soon as they married, they stopped doing that. They basically only did it for themselves, but they didn't really earn money with this anymore. And so she does that initially with her two sisters. So she forms a business with them, and that goes quite well because they start manufacturing, or they start sewing clothes and individual dresses for their customers. And then her two sisters eventually marry, and so they leave the business. And she, at the same time, she knows that's not a path that's open to me. So she starts thinking about, what can I do with this? And she's particularly challenged because she, with her weak right hand, she has trouble holding the needle and the fabric that she's working on. And even initially, when they get a sewing machine, obviously the right-handed, if you are right-handed, you're going to use it with your right hand, but her right hand's weak. So what she does is she turns it around. So she just kind of does little life hacks to make things work for her. And then she becomes very interested in her cousin's business, who owns a felt factory. And she comes up with a collection of clothes made out of felt, which are very durable. And for these hardworking women at the time, it's quite a good piece of clothing to have, because it just doesn't wear out as fast. And it's very practical for them. And so she develops this collection, and that's how she starts, basically as a seamstress. And that goes pretty well. And so pretty soon she has like a little shop. Her father actually even built her a wheelchair accessible shop, so that she has a little bit more room between the working stations and those kind of things. And she is quite successful with that. And then she, at some point, makes a little elephant, like a little toy elephant out of felt. And that is the very first little toy. And it is said that initially she only produces it as I think it's called a needle pillow. So just a little thing that you can stick your needles in so that you don't lose them on the table. And kind of the tale goes that kids that were in the shop just found it so cute and funny that they started playing with it, and that kind of gave her an idea, there's something there. And then with that, she does this at a time where also the look towards children and how you parent, that changes a little bit. So I said she was born and grew up in a very strict environment, and it was just make yourself useful, work and help in the household, help your mother, all these things. Sounds very much like fun, right? So when she makes this first little pillow, basically needle pillow, people start thinking about parenting a little bit different. So there's more toys that are being introduced to kids that are more acceptable, and more parents actually seek out these products. Right. And so she understands that there's something there, and she starts producing them. So then she also does like a little dog, a monkey, a giraffe. So she produces different shapes and forms, but she still sells the clothing. So she's not like, I'm going to go all in and full risk and just do toys now, but she still carries her business with the clothing line, and then the toys just take over time. Yeah.
Wow. So that really was the start of an empire, but she had no idea that would be become the main thing. So what was the switch? I guess what triggered from there? I mean, she had some success, but what was the next step?
Well, so she's 30 when she opens that business, when it's just the clothing line. And then part of what helps her success is that the little town that she lives in southern Germany, Gingen, which is close-ish to Stuttgart,
Yeah.
I think. It gets its own train station. So now she can actually get material in faster, but she can also send stuff out faster.
Okay.
And she's one of the first that produces catalogs, for example, and sends them out to her customers. And she really advertises her products there. So she really has a very, very good business approach. And 1879 is when she makes this small elephant. And in 1881, she sells 18 of them. So it's really not that hit right away, but it slowly gains. And by 1890, she produces 5,480 toys.
Wow.
So it's something, she just is very consistent about it. And she tries out different forms, and she sees the kids of her sisters. So she plays with her nephews and nieces, and I think she kind of does market research there. I mean, that's just practical and natural to do. If you have kids around you, then just show them a new little toy, see how they like it, right? So I think that's how she is able to manage this initial success. And then she really outgrows the shop that she has pretty soon. So she actually built her own factory. Her dad was a construction worker and had its own company. And at this point, her brother has taken over this business. So she hires her brother, and he then built her a factory with an apartment on the side where she can also live. And all of that obviously is wheelchair friendly. And so you really have to think about, this is an unmarried woman, which is already uncommon at the time. She's running her own business as a woman. That's also uncommon. She's financially independent, even though she's sitting in a wheelchair, which is twice as uncommon. And she's so successful that she's building her own factory. And so she kind of must have been the talk of town there in this little town. And she becomes so successful that basically later on she employs half of that community at her factory. So, she has to build another bigger factory because she outgrows the first one that she builds. And the second one that they build shortly before she dies is so modern. It's kind of almost like Bauhaus style. And that's even before Bauhaus ever started existing. So that was designed by her nephew. And it's full of steel and glass. So it's a very, very light workplace. You get it's a light flooded interior. And back then, when they get the design to the city council, they don't even know what to do with it because they're like, is this going to hold up? Is this structure, is this safe? And they're really unsure about it. So she's open to new approaches everywhere. Even though she does not design this building, it's her nephew who designs it. She's like, I think this looks good. I want my workers to have a good atmosphere to work in. And she is indeed very supportive of her workers. And she also makes sure she employs women. So she is very open in all of her business approaches, and that is really pretty cool about her. And she never goes about and boasts like, oh, I made so much money or any of that. Because Stuttgart, this area is very known for how these people live very frugal and can be, I don't know what a good word is in English. They certainly don't really boast about their successes, I think.
So kind of modest.
Humble.
Yeah, humble and modest.
Yeah. So she's both of that. She's frugal still, but generous with her workers.
And what's interesting to me about the story is that, I mean, because of the times, like you were talking about in the beginning, about how the woman's role in the society was pretty much a set thing, and she had something that didn't lead her down that path. It's always interesting to me to know, would it have happened if she didn't have that polio when she was a kid, and is her entrepreneurial mind, would it have been different? So it is definitely a very interesting question, but also shines a light on just the difference between between men and women of the time, because it must have been such an anomaly to have such a successful businesswoman essentially at that time.
Yeah. I really think she was quite special so to speak. And she becomes kind of a matriarch because she's founding this organization or this company, and she employs her nieces and nephews. But then what's interesting is that she herself kind of falls a bit into these gender roles herself. Okay. So she will employ her nieces, but her nieces will leave the company just like her sisters did back in the day once they get married.
Right.
Her nephews, meanwhile, get executive and management positions. Okay. So we're very much still in that role that we're in, these two roles that are kind of set for the two genders, right. Or for men and women at the time. And yeah, so that is something that I find very interesting. And then also looking from today, now I said earlier that the product that they're very, very much known for is the teddy bear. And that is something that is actually designed by her nephew, which she brings him into the company. She employs him and he starts designing new toys. As she's aging. She thinks about, okay, who can carry on the company when I'm gone? And so her nephew at some point designs this teddy bear. And at first, it's kind of a flop. They're trying to sell it in the United States. So they actually do have a network at this point. They're even marketing in London and in New York. Right. And they bring this teddy bear to New York. And the Americans are just, at first, they're not that enthused. So I say it's a bit too heavy, it's a bit too big, and it's a bit too hard. So they redesign it a little bit, and then it becomes a bit smaller. It has this plush exterior, so it's kind of cuddly and comfy. And then in the United States, Theodore Roosevelt becomes the U.S. president. Right. And now his nickname's Teddy. So there's kind of a Teddy craze going on in the United States. And that really, apparently, back then was the craze that really brought on teddy bears. And that helped really the best marketing for a new toy that you could imagine, right? So, they exhibit at a toy fair in Leipzig, which is a toy fair that I think still exists today. Okay. And they're there and they're almost closing up shop. And here comes an American salesman and says, I take 3,000 of those bears. And they're like, okay, we're going to produce them as fast as we can. Right. And so they do, and they send it to the United States. And unfortunately, today, you cannot figure out where they actually landed. So they're kind of lost. Okay. So, but these are one of the very first that they send out. So these, by today's standards, have become basically collector's items. Okay. So if someone were to find one in their attic or whatever, in their grandma's attic, wherever, those could be quite valuable.
Don't give it to your kids, folks.
Correct. And who needs Bitcoin if you can have one of the original Steif teddy bears?
Or sell one of those Steif teddy bears for Bitcoin, but just do not give them to your kids.
In 1906, by the way, they sell about 358,000 teddy bears. A year later, it's 970,000. Wow. So they're selling almost 1 million in 1907. And they do get through both world wars. They're still here. She dies in 1909. So she doesn't see the world wars. She's 62 when she dies. But she leaves behind a company that makes it through all of these storms and still exists today. So the company is and this toy is so beloved in Germany that I do think people kind of have an idea who she is. And there was a couple of years ago, there was a movie in German television that was basically her biography. It was like a biopic. Right. So she does get a bit more mention and visibility.
Okay, it's very interesting. So that was the second woman. Now let's move on to the third woman. And which sector are we in now?
We're in the culture sector. So we're actually moving into photography. So we're going to talk about Gerda Taro, who basically brought us war photography the way we know it today. And because she died very young and because she had a very, very famous partner of the name of Robert Capa, she is kind of overshadowed a little bit. Okay. But one might say Robert Capa might not have existed if it wasn't for her. So there is a very interesting story there between these two and for her, certainly.
Yeah, that is interesting because I've definitely heard of his name. And I'm not, I mean, not into photography by any means. Like, it's not something that I follow. I don't know a lot of famous people, but his name I obviously know, and I think I know some of his pictures. That might be his pictures. I guess you're going to talk a bit about that in a second. But I've never heard of her name. It's not a name that I'm aware of.
Yeah, and I think almost everyone who is interested in history of World War II, or even if they're not interested, even if they're just in school and they're sitting in their history class and they might be bored, but they might come across this blurry photo of a soldier on D-Day entering the beach, and that is a photo that Kappa took, and he did indeed take that. Okay. So that's not that's not Galataro. Yeah. So it's. But he is just so ingrained when we think about war photography. If you mention war photography today, that's the first name that comes to mind for a lot of people, because he really paved the way, and that is true. He and Galataro paved the way, right? So they were the first to do it.
Okay, so but he wasn't. Was he German?
No, he was Hungarian.
Okay, he was Hungarian, but she was German. So how did they end up together?
So she was born in Stuttgart. We're very much in the southern sector today. I don't know.
We're sticking with Baden-Württemberg, people. Let's roll with it.
So yeah, everyone who's a Baden-Württemberg, you can do a little woohoo. So.
Pick the right state.
Yeah. So, but I promise we're going to jump to East Germany. So, or to Leipzig, actually. So she's born in Stuttgart, and her parents are they come from an area that's called Galicia, I think that's how it's called in English. So if you look at it today on the map, that would be partly in Poland and part in Ukraine. Okay. So that's the region that she comes from, or that her parents come from. And they come to Germany. They're Jewish, and they live kind of a life like a lot of Jews live at that time in Germany, which is not like Orthodox Jews, not very overly religious. They're quite assimilated to the German way of living. And she's born on August 1st, 1910. She has two younger brothers that come in 1912 and 1914. And the dad runs a business in Stuttgart, and he at some point runs into some financial trouble. And then they move to Leipzig to kind of start afresh so he can start his business anew. And she's a young woman at that point. And she sees, on the one hand, she sees these troubles, the political troubles of the Weimar Republic. And at the same time, she sees these first days of Hitler coming to power. Okay. And she and her brothers, obviously being Jewish, they look at this and they're worried about it. And so her brothers are actually even affiliated with the communist movement, and they drop leaflets, anti-Nazi leaflets. And they do that as early as 1933. And after one of these protests or dropping leaflets, the police comes to the house. They find out who it was, and the police comes to the house. And because her brothers are not there, she is apprehended. Wow. So they take her they arrest her, and she is actually in prison for 2 weeks. And then her parents are kind of able to pull some strings because they reach out to the Polish consulate. Okay. Because they have Polish roots. They're reaching out to them asking for help. And then the Poles start pressuring the Germans. Why are you holding a woman which has a Polish passport? Okay. So she's lucky she gets released. And after that, it's pretty clear she cannot stay in Germany. She's now on the radar. As a Jew, she is in danger because there's more and more repressions every day. So she leaves and she goes to Paris, which is where a lot of people go to. Okay. And in Paris is where she meets Robert Capa. Right. And so what's interesting and important to know about these two, she's not born with the name Galataro. Her name is actually Gerta Pohorille when she's born. Wow. Okay. And yeah. You always have to spell that name. And his name's not Robert Capa, and I think more people know that's not his original name. So he comes from Hungary, and his name is Andre Friedman. Mm-hmm. And so the two meet kind of by coincidence in Paris. He speaks to her roommate, and he started out as a photographer, and he needs a model for some sort of ad that he's shooting. And so he talks to her roommate, and he's kind of he looks a little bit gruff, and so he's kind of like, he's unshaven, he's kind of hair's not combed, and he just looks a bit. She's not quite sure about him, so the roommate asks Gerta to come with her, kind of to just as a little safety feature. And she comes with, and the two start talking, and they find out they're both Jewish. They've both left their home country, so they have a lot in common. Right. And at first they become friends, and then they even start a romance later on. I mean, they're both very young, like in their early 20s. Uh-huh. So yeah, that's how these two meet in Paris, which is a place where a lot of Europeans go to at that time. Mm-hmm. So especially Eastern Europeans, and obviously more and more people from Germany who want to get away from these repressions and the changes in the political system. Okay. Right.
So is it then that she starts developing her own love for photography, or because you said I don't think she had been doing that before, right?
No, she basically just starts working when she comes to Paris. That's when she enters work life. And because she's a foreigner, she doesn't even really have a work permit in the beginning. So she has to take everything that comes her way. And it's like half illegal, which is how a lot of foreigners make do at this time. And she works like secretary jobs, stuff like that. And then through him, he teaches her photography. So she gets interested in it. He teaches her photography and how to develop, because you're still doing that in dark rooms at the time, all of these things. And she starts working in a photo agency. So when they start working with photography, this is a time where photo magazines become very prominent, because you have now coming new technology to the scene, which gives you just better pictures. So photography in and of itself is becoming a more professional discipline. And with new photo magazines, they really get a place to shine. And these photo agencies hire photographers to cover certain things like protests in Paris and all of these things, the workers' movement. And then they sell it to these magazines. So she starts working there while he's out scouring the streets for motifs. Yeah. But at some point they notice, because of their last names, it's instantly clear that they're foreigners. And it makes it harder for them to get jobs, because Paris is Parisians start feeling overwhelmed with how many foreigners are in the country. Right. And then you have some of these sentiments are taking our jobs. We'd rather give them to Frenchmen and French women. And so it's most likely Gerta that comes up with the idea, let's rebrand ourselves. Okay. And let's do that by giving ourselves new names and a new story. And so André Friedman becomes Robert Capa, the supposedly successful American photographer who just came to Paris and is now like happy to take on assignments. But mind you, because he's so successful in the US, he's also going to cost you more than someone who works in Paris. Very clever. So very clever. So he takes like 3 times of what amateur photographers in Paris take. So Gerta Pohorilla becomes Gerda Taro. There's some speculation that maybe she liked Greta Garbo so much that the famous actress that she kind of played around there, and that's where her name comes from. In truth, nobody knows where these two names come from. They want something that's short, that's memorable, and that doesn't give away the nationality. Right. And so she claims she's his agent. And then, for example, when there's people calling and say, we'd like to meet Robert Capa, she will send Capa, but as his own assistant. So, I mean, he will show up and he will look like he does, right? Obviously he doesn't look like an American. He has black hair and he's very strong eyebrows, and he just does not look very American. So, he goes there, but he claims he's his own assistant. Right. So it is it's quite smart what they come up with there.
Yeah, and very early marketing there.
Yeah, and it works out for them. And it's really very likely that she came up with this scheme, because he was more impulsive. He was a bit younger. And she was very driven. That's what a
Right.
lot of people say about her, that she really knew where she wanted to get. She was a fashionable young woman, so she had a way of carrying herself, and she was business savvy. So it's more likely that she at least came up with the idea, and then they both filled it with life, so to speak.
Okay.
And yeah, so they start taking photographs. She has some published, but because they're marketing him under his name sells. So in the beginning, they sometimes make the conscious decision to sell some of her photos under his name because it just gets them more money.
Right.
So that's the idea behind it. And where we later see that is in the Spanish Civil War, 1936, 1937, where they both work. And this is basically where war photography is born.
And do we know now which photographs were hers and which were his, or is there still some question over exactly which ones were taken?
Both. So with some, we know it pretty clearly which ones are hers and which ones are his. And we haven't had a case of here's a super famous Kappa photo, which actually was shot by Taro. So it's more because a lot of people also don't know all of these photos that were taken during the Spanish War. They're not as famous as his later works, for example.
Okay.
There's one from the Spanish Civil War that people really know, which is called Fallen Soldier.
Okay.
At Falling Soldier, it shows a guy supposedly being hit by the bullet in the moment of his death, basically, in the moment of being hit by the bullet, and he falls backwards, and his arms are kind of backwards. And it's kind of on a hillside. That's a very, very famous photo, which has a controversy around it, but not a controversy whether or not it was taken by Kappa. So that is clear. He's taken it. Right. But indeed, years later, actually a couple of years ago, in Mexico, there was a suitcase that resurfaced with tons of negatives in it. And those are, I think, thousands of negatives from the Spanish Civil War. And it's a very old, it's called a suitcase. It's basically just a card box. And then someone has drawn like some columns on the inside and has numbered the negatives that are in there, and then has written where they were taken. Okay. And it has photos from 3 different photographers in it, from Taro, from Robert Capa, and from a friend of theirs who was called Chim, because he had such an unpronounceable Polish last name that he just went by the nickname of Chim. And these 3 traveled a lot in Spain during the Civil War and took pictures there. And those negatives were apparently in Kappa's possession, and he at some point sent them out of France when the Second World War just got so crazy that it was clear France was being invaded. So he just wanted to rescue his works, his photographs. So he threw all of them in a box and sent them out. And they went through several hands and ended up in Mexico and were found decades later.
Amazing.
And so with these, they're still trying to figure out which ones were taken by whom. So sometimes you know they traveled to X on a certain date, and then they can kind of do it by their travel itinerary and find out, okay, Kappa was here. So does that make sense with what we're seeing here on these photos? Is that some sort of action on the front that was going on that day? Could that be him? Mm-hmm. So that's still, but that's quite a task to do. Okay,
wow, that's incredible. But now, I mean, his name is obviously one that we know. He's iconic and everything. She's lesser known. What was? How did her career play out in conjunction with his? How is it that he is so prominent?
Yeah, so he. Mostly because he outlives her, sadly. So, like I said, a lot of these stories have a very sad side to it. And so for them, they both get into the Civil War at the same time. So in 1936, the Civil War breaks out, and it's Franco and his fascist movement that tries to overthrow the government in Spain. And the 2 of them, being Jewish, are really very highly invested in this. And Spain, in this time, the war there kind of becomes a proxy war in Europe, where basically all of Europe is looking at Spain, and they're looking at how is this war against fascism turning out? Because this is the first time where you really have this in open warfare. And it is a movement that is gaining hold in all of Europe. And so that's why these two are so highly invested in it. And they go down there and they decide they want to show the world what's going on. And they take with them their cameras, obviously. And this is a time where the technology has also advanced. So Kappa has a small Leica, which a Leica, no, most people have heard of a Leica, which is 35 millimeters, that film that we might still even know from our childhood. Right. So with this camera, which is still pretty new, you can really get close. You can get really close to the action. So what he does there is he runs with soldiers, or he's right next to them when they duck behind a barricade or something like that. So he's so close like never before. And all these pictures then are published 1 or 2 days later in one of those magazines in Europe, or maybe a week later. But it's almost, for Europe, this is so new, it's almost like it's playing out in real time before their eyes.
Right.
And Gerda Taro at the beginning, she works with a slightly bigger camera, which is more of a boxy camera that you hold right in front of yourself, and then you look down into the viewfinder. Okay. And what these cameras do is you can take real good portraits. And so in the beginning, he's the one who runs after the soldiers and takes the real close-up shots. And she's the one who takes portraits of, for example, refugees that flee from the front lines. So you have a mother with a child that's clutching her skirt, or you have refugees in a camp that are standing there, and you can just see on their faces how devastated and confused they are, because they only have left what they're wearing on their bodies, but they've lost everything. And she takes a portrait of a young boy, a young orphan who is eating soup and is just looking straight at her camera. So she takes these very, very personal shots in the beginning, these portraits that really show you the human side of the war, not just what's going on at the front, but what does it do to the civil, right. On the civil side, right. So to speak. And then the two of them, she later on also starts working with his Leica, and she then also takes these daring shots where she will even cower in a ditch, and she will hold the camera up above her head and still take pictures as the air bombs and air raids are going on. And yeah, she says at some point, well, if we die, we're still going to have documented what happened here so that the world can see it. And that's really the approach that they're taking. Right. And so in 1937, in July, she goes to the front and she does one of these very, very daring assignments again, where she is very close to the action. They have a horrible air raid during that day. They come out of it, and then she wants to get back, and it's her last day in Spain. She wants to go back to France, and they want to, with Robert Capa, she wants to plan like the next trip. So she jumps on a pickup truck on the running board, I think that's called, on the outside of the pickup truck. So they start driving back into town, and then it looks like those bombers are coming back. So there's confusion on the road. The driver's kind of distracted for a moment, and then he sees too late that there's a tank coming at him. Oh. So he throws that wheel around, the whole car swerves, and she is being thrown off that running board, and she lands right in front of this tank, and the tank rolls over her. And so she has devastating injuries. They get her to a hospital, but she dies sometime that night because those injuries are just so grave. And it's 1937. She's 27 years old. And young. She's so young. And she actually becomes, in the very immediate aftermath, almost a hero. So she gets a very big funeral in Paris. And there's thousands of people that actually attend her funeral. But then this is 1937. So very shortly you have World War II. Right. And that just overshadows the civil war in Spain, which in a way, now obviously because it is such a bigger, more devastating experience, but in a way that's so until this day, we know much more about the World War II than the Spanish Civil War, obviously. Yeah. And then he goes on with his career. So he becomes so much more popular or famous with these shots that he takes in World War II. And then he goes to Indochina and covers the war there. And that's where he himself steps on a landmine and then dies. Right. at the age of, I think he's in his late 40s, maybe early 50s tops. So he doesn't really get that old either. Yeah. And he's so devastated after her death that he initially can't even really speak of her. And her entire family pretty much perishes in World War II, in the Holocaust. And so there's nobody really who could tell her story for a long time. And that's why she's kind of forgotten. But she is with that Mexican suitcase especially, and there's the International Center of Photography, I think they're called, the ICP in New York. I think they were founded, or they are an outcome of Robert Capa's Magnum agency. So the Capa and his brother were actually involved there, and the center was founded to really uphold the memory of these photographers. And they really work to uphold not just his memory, but also hers, and also, for example, Chim's, who I talked about earlier. Right. So they try to give credit where credit is due. So it is nice to see her. There's good photo books with her photos and her stories. So it's nice to see her come back and getting some recognition, the attention. Yeah, very fascinating stories of these women. Now that we've covered those three, let's touch on your two honorable mentions, because I couldn't limit you to three, so we're going to have two honorable mentions. So I'm very curious to hear. Yeah, so number one would also be basically someone who was in politics, or more of an activist, I think you would call her today, which is Anita Augspurg. Okay. So she lived from 1857 to 1943. And she is indeed one of the very early women's rights activists, basically. So she's one of the most important figures during the women's movement around the turn of the century that is fighting for the vote and for women's rights in general. So, I mean, this is a time where women still are not allowed to even have higher education. They can't go to university. And very slowly, this is changing. So Switzerland's one of the first countries to allow women to study. And she goes there, she studies law, and then she really is on the forefront of fighting for women's rights. And she's one who also, she's not shy about it, which is kind of what I like about her. So she really, she's outspoken, and which is also still very often overlooked, but thankfully that's starting to change. She's living with a woman, and which is somewhat, you might think, somewhat uncommon. But when you actually look at the women's movement of that time, there's a lot of women that actually live together, that are in partnerships. And there's a wonderful podcaster friend of mine who covers that, by the way. Her name is Bianca, and her podcast is Frauen von damals, and she really covers, she writes a dissertation on this topic, so she's really working on it. And she also has a podcast on it and talks a lot about these women. It's super fascinating to really look into how many women-loving women were fighting for women at that time. So that's pretty cool. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay. So that is number one. So also a lawyer and an activist, and also in her early years, an entrepreneur, you might say, because she and her first serious partner run a photography studio together. And in Munich, and they're very, very successful. And in their studio, a lot of the photos of the women's movement of that time are actually taken. So that's pretty cool. So it kind of all touches and circles together there. So so that, and then honorable mention number two. Honorable mention number two is a name you might have heard. I don't know if you still find her shops in German cities. Have you heard of Beate Uhse? Oh yeah, this is it's a chain of sex shops, or is that correct? That's correct. That's correct. I think you just won a sex toy. Yes. I only know that because the city that I moved to, no, not the city that I lived in, second in Germany, was Würzburg. And there was was it there or was it in Frankfurt? I can't remember now where I saw it, but there was a Beate Uhse store that I saw. But that was back in 2007, and it closed down afterwards. And I think that they may have closed a lot of the stores down, if not all of them, right? Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if they actually closed down entirely. I think they still at least have an online shop. I know that they were in some financial trouble at some point. But anyway, she is indeed the head behind this.
Right.
But that's not all that she is. So
So she's a real person. I guess I thought it was just a name, like a marketing thing, basically.
Yeah, I mean, quite often we kind of forget that. Well, wait a minute, these names come from someplace. Is that so? Indeed, but before she founded this company, she was actually a female pilot in Germany in the 1930s. So she would transport planes in the 1930s back and forth. So that was her first career, so to speak. I think she even was captured at some point and spent a little bit of time, but I'm not 100% on that. I think she was.
Okay.
But in any case, after the war, what she started thinking about was the problem of contraception.
Okay.
So because women didn't really have a lot of options if they were trying to avoid becoming pregnant. And so she thinks about that a lot. And obviously, I mean, a lot of people in Germany are still, they're trying to make do. They simply cannot afford to have children right after the war. So that's kind of where that thought comes from. And so she puts together kind of a leaflet and explains how you can, like, if you're counting your period, women will be familiar with that, how you can actually kind of track your cycle. And with that, at least get a bit more safety where, you know, okay, this is the time where I'm more safe. And so she basically informs people how they can just use knowledge about their body basically to make sure they don't get pregnant. And that becomes so popular that I think she sends it out for just a couple of cent. I mean, at that point, we don't have euro and cent, it's Pfennig. Yeah. But she sends it out for just a tiny amount of money. And then from then on, she keeps thinking about this whole, okay, what's actually happening in German bedrooms. And she starts thinking about basically the sex life of society. And she slowly but surely introduces all these products, which can be toys, but also lingerie. And so she turns this into an erotic empire, so to speak, and builds these shops and has an online shop. And I think by today's standards, I mean, now we have these shops like, I probably shouldn't name drop, but now we have newer shops and they're much more, they might seem more modern. So by today's standards, the kind of lingerie that she was selling at the end might seem a bit outdated. But when she formed this company, she really was the first. And basically she's the inventor of the so-called, what we in Germany call sex shop.
Amazing. So, I really had no idea that there was, especially that she was a pilot, I had no idea that there was any history to who Beate Uhse was. And now I'm very intrigued to read more about it, because it also started more as a sex education thing than specifically trying to sell sex toys. But that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I do find that very fascinating. And it's just, I mean, she's a businesswoman, and it just happens that she's selling erotic products, or was. I mean, she died already. She died in 2001. But I mean, she built a little empire there. She was very, very successful with that.
And especially starting at a time when it was obviously very taboo as well, or kind of frowned upon in a lot of ways.
Correct. Yeah. So
wow. So there you go. 5 women from German history who are probably lesser known. I think probably lesser known to a lot of Germans too, right? It's not just to foreigners. These are women who maybe haven't, as I said in the beginning, haven't made it into history books or don't get that much recognition. So it was very, very fascinating to hear about these women, and thank you so much, Jasmin. You're a great storyteller. It's so much fun to have you on to talk about these things. People can listen to your podcast, which is in German. It's called HerStory. HerStory, of course, covers not just German women, but all kinds of women from different continents and so on.
That's right. I jump around from country to country, and I jump around in time. So, I mean, obviously with the women that we talked about today, they're all very much about 19th, 20th century. Yeah. but I do go farther back in history every now and then. So I do try to mix it up as often as possible.
Great. And I'll put all the links in the show notes. I will also put links to the women that we've spoken about in the show so people can start doing their own research. There's a lot more to these stories than what we've heard here. We've just touched on the main points, I would think. But definitely go and check out all those show notes. And yeah, get in touch with Jasmin as well. Jasmin, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time and doing all the heavy lifting in this episode. I didn't do any research. I didn't do anything. So I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me on and for letting me talk endlessly, because I feel like if you would not have stopped me, I would have just kept going. So thank you for moderating and asking very smart questions.
Ooh, well, thank you. I do try. Thanks for listening. As always, music in this episode by my band 10 Cent Janes. Additional music by Ryan Anderson. Until the end, I'll speak to you next week. Auf Wiederhören.